What did my wife name our son? I missed my son's birth because I was passed out drunk at my buddy's bachelor party. When I got to the hospital, Elaine looked exhausted and sad and said the baby was healthy and already named. I asked what she'd chosen, and she stared at me and said, "What we agreed on, obviously." I nodded like I remembered, but I couldn't recall agreeing on anything. We'd discussed dozens of names for 9 months, but never settled on one. The shame of not knowing my own son's name made me feel sick, but I couldn't ask Elaine without admitting I'd been too drunk to remember. I had to figure this out myself. The nurses kept calling him baby or your son when they came to check on him. I tried the Starbucks trick and loudly said, "I'm going to get coffee for everyone, one for me, one for Elaine, and one for baby," trailing off, hoping someone would fill in the name. The nurse just said, "That's sweet, but he's too young for coffee," and laughed at her own joke. At home, I looked everywhere for clues. The nursery letters spelled DREAM, which wasn't a name. I checked every gift, but they all just said generic things like, "Welcome, little one." I even opened sealed envelopes hoping someone had written the name inside, but found only gift receipts. When my mother visited, I said, "You know what's funny is how his name means," and waited for her to explain the meaning. She just said, "Oh, honey, all names mean something," and kissed his forehead. I tried asking what nickname we should use, and she said, "Whatever feels natural," which didn't help at all. I called the pediatrician, pretending to be confused about appointment times. I said, "I have Tuesday down for baby. Sorry, I can't read my own handwriting," hoping they'd say the name. The receptionist just said, "Yes, Tuesday at 2 for your son," and hung up. I created a fake email account and sent Elaine a message pretending to be a photographer offering free newborn photos. I asked her to confirm the baby's name for the session. She didn't reply, but gave me a weird look at dinner and asked if I'd gotten any strange emails lately. The daycare forms had J as the first initial, and my heart raced. I spent all night listing J names, but couldn't remember choosing any of them. I tested Elaine by saying, "You know what other J names I liked?" She just said, "We already chose," and walked away. I tried recording Elaine secretly, but she only called him my love and sweet boy. When her sister called, I heard her spell something out loud, but it was just PACIFIER when her sister asked what to buy. I'd hidden behind the door for nothing. I told my friend I wanted to buy one of those wooden name puzzles and asked where he'd gotten his kids. He gave me the website and said, "Just type in the name when you order." I said, "Right, but how many letters should I order to be safe?" He looked confused and said, "However many are in your son's name," and changed the subject. I pretended my phone was broken and asked Elaine's mom to text me the baby's information for our insurance. She sent back his birthday and weight and length, but referred to him only as my perfect grandson. When I said she forgot to include his name, she wrote back, "You have that part silly," with a heart emoji. I pretended to have a dream where the baby was older and asked Elaine what he looked like. I said, "He came up to me and said, 'Hi, Dad, I'm—'" But I woke up before he said it. She just said dreams about the future were meaningless and went back to sleep. At the bank, I said I wanted to open a college fund and acted like I'd forgotten the Social Security card. I asked if they could look it up by name, hoping they'd read it out loud. The teller said they'd need the card and suggested I come back later. I even tried asking the baby directly when we were alone, like maybe somehow he'd give me a sign. I went through every J name I could think of while watching his face for any reaction. He just stared at me with those unfocused newborn eyes, and I felt insane for thinking a 3-week-old would somehow tell me his own name. 3 weeks had passed and all I knew was the name started with J. I was desperate enough to consider hiring a private investigator to somehow find out what my own son was called. I practiced saying different J names to see if any felt right, but they all sounded wrong. I tried one last trick and told Elaine I'd run into someone from high school who had a son with the same name as ours. I said, "What are the odds, right?" She said, "Pretty good since it's a common name," but still didn't say what it was. I was losing my mind. I finally broke down and admitted I couldn't remember what we'd decided to name him. Her face went cold, and she said she'd known all along that I didn't remember because I'd been drunk the entire 3rd trimester. She said since I'd chosen alcohol over our family, she'd named him herself while I was passed out at that party. She told me the birth certificate was in her jewelry box. I found it folded inside, and my hands shook as I opened it. I had to read the name 3 times because I couldn't believe what she'd done. Jameson. The paper said Jameson like the whiskey bottle I'd been clutching every night for months. My legs went weak, and I had to sit on the bed because this couldn't be real. She'd named our baby after the exact brand I'd been drinking when I missed his birth. The certificate shook in my hands, and I kept blinking, but the letters stayed the same. Jameson Michael with her last name, not mine. I stood up too fast, and the room spun a little as I walked back to the living room where Elaine sat on the couch with her arms crossed. She looked up when I came in, and there was no surprise on her face, just this tired anger I'd never seen before. "Now you know," she said quietly. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first, because what could I even say to this? "You named him after whiskey," I finally managed, and she nodded slowly. "The nurse asked for a name while you were passed out at that hotel, and I looked at the news on my phone showing your buddy posting videos of you doing shots." Her voice stayed flat and calm, which was worse than yelling. "Jameson was the bottle in your hand in every single video, so I figured it was fitting since you chose it over us." I tried to sit down, but she held up her hand to stop me. "This is cruel to him," I said, and my voice cracked a little. "Kids will make fun of him and he'll hate us when he finds out why we picked it." She laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, just this bitter sound. "You already gave him an absent father, so what's a difficult name compared to that?" I wanted to argue, but she kept going. "Remember the 20-week ultrasound you missed because you were too hungover?" She counted on her fingers as she talked. "The birthing class you slept through drunk, the baby shower you left early to meet your drinking buddies, every morning you couldn't feel him kick because you were throwing up in the bathroom." Each thing she said hit me like a punch, because I remembered all of it, or at least the parts I wasn't blacked out for. "The name stays as accountability for both of us," she continued. "Me for staying with you this long, and you for everything you chose over your family." I dropped to my knees right there on the living room floor. "Please let me fix this," I begged, and I wasn't too proud to cry. "I'll pay for everything to change it legally and do all the paperwork myself." She shook her head before I even finished talking. "You can't even remember to pay the electric bill sober, so why would I trust you with legal documents?" She stood up and walked past me toward the hallway. "The name stays." That night she put my pillow and a blanket in the den and pointed at the pull-out couch. I didn't argue because what right did I have after everything? I could hear the baby crying through the wall and Elaine getting up to feed him while I lay there useless on the uncomfortable mattress. Every time he cried, it felt like the walls were telling me how badly I'd screwed up. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went to the kitchen. I opened the cabinet above the fridge and pulled down the emergency vodka I'd hidden there. Then I stopped and really looked at it. This bottle and ones like it had cost me being there when my son was born, and now they'd cost him a normal name too. I poured it down the sink and watched it swirl away. Then I went to the garage and got the case of beer from the mini fridge and poured those out too. The smell made my stomach turn, but I kept going. The cooking wine went next, even though Elaine might get mad about that later. The bottle of whiskey hidden behind the toolbox, the flask in my car glove compartment, even the mini bottles I'd stashed in my golf bag, all went down the drain. When the sun came up, I was sitting on the garage floor surrounded by empty bottles, feeling sick, but determined. I pulled out my phone and texted my buddy from the bachelor party. "Hey man, I need help getting sober," I typed and hit send before I could delete it. 3 hours went by before he answered, and all he wrote was, "That's heavy, man," with no follow-up. I stared at his response and realized we'd never really been friends at all, just two guys who enabled each other's drinking. That afternoon, while Elaine took the baby to her mom's house, I sat at the computer and started searching for how to legally change a baby's name. The websites all said both parents had to agree and sign papers in front of a judge. Court fees were $500 minimum plus lawyer costs if you hired one. The process took at least 6 weeks and could be denied if the judge didn't think you had good enough reasons. Some states required publishing the name change in a newspaper for a month in case anyone objected. Every site I checked said the same thing about needing both parents, and I knew Elaine would never sign those papers. I switched tabs and started typing an apology email to my mother and Elaine's parents. "I'm sorry I missed the birth and I want to explain," I wrote, but then stopped. How could I explain that I'd gotten so drunk I missed my son being born, and now he was named after whiskey? How could I tell my mother her grandson would carry this reminder forever because I'd chosen bottles over my family? I highlighted everything and hit delete. The blank screen stared back at me, and I closed the laptop. There was nothing I could write that would make this okay. The next morning, I drove to the AA meeting location I'd found online and pulled into the parking lot behind a strip mall. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel as I watched people walking through the side door of the community center. Some looked normal in work clothes, while others seemed rough around the edges with old jackets and tired faces. I turned off the engine and put my hand on the door handle, but couldn't make myself pull it. 20 minutes passed with me sitting there watching people go in while my stomach twisted into knots. A woman about my mom's age walked past my window and glanced at me with a knowing look. She paused like she might say something, but kept walking when I looked away. I started the car and drove home feeling like the biggest coward alive. 3 days later was Jameson's 1-month checkup, and Elaine told me I had to come since she needed help with the car seat. The waiting room was packed with other parents and crying babies when the nurse came out with her clipboard. "Jameson?" she called out, looking around the room. Every parent's head turned to look at us, and I felt my face burn red. A mom with twin girls gave us a weird look and whispered something to her husband. I picked up the car seat and followed the nurse down the hall, trying not to think about what everyone was thinking. The doctor checked him over and said he was healthy and gaining weight perfectly. On the way out, another nurse said, "Bye, Jameson," in that sing-song voice, and I saw two dads exchange glances by the door. That night, after Elaine went to bed early, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. I started writing a letter to my son, trying to explain everything, even though he'd never understand it for years. The words came out messy and full of crossed-out lines, as I promised him his name wouldn't define him. I wrote that I'd work every day to give it better meaning than the pain it carried now. I told him about my drinking and how I'd failed him before he was even born. The letter went on for 3 pages before I folded it up and put it in an envelope marked with his name. I'd give it to him when he was old enough to understand, or maybe I'd burn it before then. The next morning, Elaine was waiting at the kitchen table with typed pages in front of her. She pushed them across to me without saying anything, and I read through her conditions. Mandatory therapy twice a week with someone who specialized in addiction. 90 AA meetings in 90 days with signed proof I'd attended. Separate bank accounts with her controlling all household expenses. Sleeping in different rooms indefinitely with no physical contact unless she initiated it. Drug and alcohol testing whenever she asked with no warning. I signed at the bottom because the alternative was her taking Jameson and leaving completely. 2 days later, I sat in Melinda Hess's office for my first therapy appointment. She made me go through my entire drinking history starting from high school. Every party and blackout and morning I couldn't remember got dragged into the light. She wrote notes the whole time without judging, but her questions cut deep. How many drinks per day? How many days per week? When did I start hiding bottles? How much money did I spend on alcohol each month? The answers made me sick as I added them up for the first time. She created a treatment plan with daily check-ins and homework assignments that felt impossible, but I nodded and said I'd try because I had to. The next week, I finally made it through the AA meeting door and sat in the back row. People shared their stories, and I listened to their years of sobriety and their day ones. When the meeting ended, a man named Felix Baldwin came over and introduced himself. He'd been sober 12 years and had that calm way of talking that made you want to trust him. I told him about Jameson's name and waited for the judgment, but he just nodded. "Shame is part of the disease," he said, and offered to sponsor me. We exchanged numbers, and he told me to call him every morning at 7 sharp. 3 days later, I finally called my mother and asked her to come over alone. She sat on the couch while I told her everything about missing the birth and the drinking and Jameson's name. The silence stretched out for what felt like forever before she spoke. She said she wouldn't enable me anymore by pretending everything was fine, but she'd support my recovery. No more family dinners with wine, and no more excuses for my behavior to others. She'd help with Jameson, but only if I stayed sober and in treatment. That Thursday, I tried to help with the 3 a.m. feeding while Elaine slept. My hands were shaking bad from withdrawal as I mixed the formula. The bottle slipped, and formula went everywhere, including all over Jameson's sleeper. He started crying, and Elaine appeared in the doorway without a word. She took him from me and walked back to her room, closing the door behind her. I cleaned up the mess and went back to the couch, knowing I'd lost more of her trust. Over the next few days, we worked out a schedule for living in the same house. I had specific times I could be in the kitchen and bathroom. We'd alternate who got the living room each evening. Grocery money went into an envelope that Elaine controlled. Baby duties were scheduled on a calendar with no deviations allowed. Every interaction felt cold and formal, like we were roommates who hated each other. She'd text me instead of talking, even when we were in the same house. Monday morning, my phone rang with a call from HR asking me to come in for a meeting. They said my performance since returning from paternity leave had been concerning. Projects were late, and clients had complained about missed calls and sloppy work. They were putting me on an improvement plan with weekly check-ins and measurable goals. My manager would be reviewing all my work before it went to clients. If things didn't improve in 30 days, we'd have another conversation about my future there. That meeting destroyed me, and I walked out of the office building feeling like everything was falling apart at once. The pressure built up in my chest as I drove past the usual turn toward home and kept going without any real destination. My hands gripped the wheel tight, and I found myself pulling into a gas station 20 minutes later. I went inside for water, but my feet carried me to the beer cooler instead. The condensation on the glass door felt cold under my palm as I stood there for what must have been 5 minutes. I grabbed a single tall can and paid the cashier, who didn't even look up from his phone. Back in my car, I cracked it open, and the familiar smell hit me hard. The first sip burned going down after weeks without alcohol. The relief lasted maybe 5 minutes before the guilt crashed over me like a wave. I sat there holding the half-empty can and crying in that gas station parking lot. My phone buzzed with Felix's daily check-in text, and I knew I had to tell him. I drove home and poured the rest down the kitchen sink, then called him immediately. He didn't yell or lecture, just told me to get to a meeting tonight and we'd talk after. Then came the harder part. Elaine was feeding Jameson when I walked into the nursery and told her I'd bought a beer and drank half of it. Her face went completely blank as she stood up and placed the baby in his crib. She walked past me to their bedroom and started throwing clothes into a bag. I followed her, trying to explain it was just one slip, but she kept packing without looking at me. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. She picked up Jameson and his diaper bag and said she'd be at her mother's for a week to figure out if this was worth continuing. The door closed, and I stood there in the empty house, hearing nothing but the clock ticking. I spent that first night alone cleaning the nursery from top to bottom. The dream letters on the wall seemed to mock me as I organized toys and folded tiny clothes. Everything we'd planned during those happy months before his birth felt impossibly far away now. The gap between those dreams and this reality made my chest ache. The next morning, Melinda fit me in for an emergency session. She had me write out every person I'd hurt with my drinking, starting with Elaine and Jameson. The list grew longer than I expected as I added my mother, Elaine's family, co-workers, and friends I'd let down. Then we identified my specific triggers like work stress, feeling inadequate as a father, and the shame spiral that made me want to numb everything. For each trigger, we created a concrete plan like calling Felix when stressed or doing push-ups when shame hit. She made me practice saying out loud what I'd do instead of drinking in each situation. We role-played scenarios until the responses felt more natural. I left with homework to add 3 new coping strategies each day. That afternoon, I was organizing papers when I noticed the pediatrician forms from Jameson's last visit. The first name field showed Jameson clearly, but the middle name space was completely blank. My heart started racing as an idea formed. Maybe I couldn't change his first name, but adding something meaningful in the middle could help balance the pain. I spent hours researching middle names that meant hope, redemption, or new beginnings. 2 days later, I met with a mediator named Desmond Barr, who specialized in family law. His office had toys in the corner and tissues on every surface. He explained that courts rarely approve first name changes without both parents' consent, but middle names were different. Adding a middle name was seen as less disruptive, and judges often approved them if both parents eventually agreed. He walked me through the paperwork and filing fees and realistic timelines. Then he mentioned something that stopped me cold. He said Elaine had consulted him 3 weeks ago about custody arrangements and what would happen if I didn't maintain sobriety. She'd already been planning for my failure before I even slipped. The hurt mixed with understanding as I realized how scared she must have been watching me struggle. She was protecting herself and Jameson from the chaos I'd brought into their lives. Desmond gave me copies of standard co-parenting agreements to review. That evening, I made a decision sitting in my empty apartment. I would accept Jameson as his first name and own that consequence of my drinking. But I'd propose adding a middle name that represented hope and recovery and moving forward. Something like Michael after my grandfather who got sober at 50 and stayed that way for 30 years. This felt like taking responsibility while still creating something positive. Felix called that night for our check-in, and I told him about the middle name idea. He listened, then said something that hit hard. My son needed a present father more than a perfect name. The naming battle couldn't matter more than staying sober. If I relapsed again over this stress, then Jameson would grow up without me, regardless of what we called him. His words stuck with me as I lay on the couch, unable to sleep. 3 days before Elaine's deadline to return, she texted asking if I could watch Jameson for 3 hours while she ran errands. My hands shook as I prepared bottles and checked the diaper supply twice. She dropped him off without coming inside, just handed him over at the door. Those 3 hours went smoothly as I fed him, changed 2 diapers, and even got him down for a nap. When she picked him up, I had everything organized and documented in the baby log she'd started. She looked surprised but just nodded and left with him. It was a tiny victory, but it felt like progress. The week was almost up, and I didn't know what decision she'd make about us. The next morning, Melinda's office felt smaller with both of us there, Elaine sitting as far from me as the couch allowed, while I pressed myself into the opposite corner. Melinda asked Elaine to share her experience first, and I watched my wife's hands twist in her lap as she started talking about the nights I came home late. She described waiting up until 2 or 3 in the morning wondering if I'd crashed the car or passed out somewhere. She talked about hiding my keys and finding them gone anyway in the morning. She mentioned the smell of whiskey on my breath when I'd kiss her goodnight, and how she'd started turning away. She listed the birthday dinners I'd shown up drunk to and the family events where she'd made excuses for why I was in the bathroom so long. Her voice stayed flat and steady, but tears rolled down her face as she explained checking my hiding spots every day and counting bottles. She said the worst part was watching me choose drinking over feeling the baby kick or going to ultrasounds or painting the nursery together. I wanted to defend myself or explain, but Melinda had told me beforehand that this session was for listening only. My jaw ached from clenching it shut, and my fingernails left marks in my palms, but I stayed quiet through all of it. When Elaine finished, she looked exhausted, and Melinda handed her tissues while scheduling our next appointment. That afternoon, I sat with my laptop deleting years of evidence from my social media accounts. Photos from bar crawls and brewery tours disappeared with each click. Posts about hangover cures and drinking memes got removed one by one. I found pictures from my bachelor party friend's wedding where I was holding multiple drinks and deleted those too. My college reunion album full of beer pong tournaments went next. I removed myself from groups about craft beer and whiskey tasting and wine clubs I'd joined but never participated in. Then I went through my phone contacts, deleting numbers for drinking buddies and bartenders who'd become too familiar. Each deletion felt like cutting away pieces of my old life, but Felix had been clear that keeping these connections would make staying sober harder. The next day, I spent an hour mapping new routes on my phone to avoid my usual triggers. My normal way to work passed 3 liquor stores and 2 bars I used to stop at for happy hour. The new route added 10 minutes but kept me on residential streets away from temptation. I changed my grocery store to one without a beer aisle near the entrance. I found a different gas station that didn't sell alcohol at all, even though it meant driving further for fuel. I switched gyms, because my old one was next to a sports bar where I'd grab drinks after working out. These changes felt weird and inconvenient, but Felix said disrupting old patterns was essential for breaking habits. At Thursday's meeting, I raised my hand when they asked if anyone wanted to share for the first time. My voice shook as I stood up and introduced myself as an alcoholic father who'd missed his son's birth because I was passed out drunk. I explained about the name Jameson and how my wife had chosen it as a permanent reminder of what I'd picked over my family. The room stayed quiet as I talked about the shame of carrying that name forward and trying to stay sober for him, despite the daily reminder of my worst moment. When I sat down, an older woman came up during break and touched my shoulder gently. She said her daughter was named Brandy after what her ex-husband was drinking when he left them, and that names could become symbols of survival instead of shame. 2 days later, I heard Elaine's car in the driveway and watched through the window as she carried Jameson's car seat up the walk. She came in without knocking, but stopped in the entryway instead of going to the living room like before. She explained the new arrangement in a business voice while I stood there nodding at each rule. I would sleep in the basement, and she'd take the bedroom with Jameson's bassinet. We'd have scheduled times for me to care for him while she showered or ran errands, but she'd handle all-night feedings. I couldn't have anyone over without telling her first, and she wanted receipts for everything I bought to track spending. The kitchen would be split with separate shelves, and we'd alternate cooking nights but eat separately. She'd already moved my clothes downstairs and set up a small dresser near the basement couch. It wasn't the reunion I'd hoped for, but having them back in the house felt like progress, even with all the boundaries. I ordered the wooden blocks online that night, choosing ones that spelled out Jameson in bright primary colors. When they arrived 3 days later, I arranged them on his nursery shelf while Elaine was grocery shopping with him. She didn't say anything when she saw them, but I noticed she didn't move them either, even when she reorganized everything else in the room later that week. The bank appointment took forever, as I filled out forms for the college savings account with Jameson's full legal name printed carefully in each box. I set up automatic transfers of $50 every week, which wasn't much, but would add up over 18 years. The banker kept trying to sell me additional investment products, but I stuck with the basic savings plan and left with the folder of documents. At work, HR called me in to discuss the modified schedule I'd requested to accommodate therapy and meetings. My manager sat in the corner looking skeptical, while the HR representative went through the paperwork for reduced hours and flexible timing. They approved it as a medical accommodation, but warned that my performance reviews would reflect the schedule change. My phone rang that evening showing my bachelor party friend's name, and I almost didn't answer but figured I owed him an explanation. He wanted to meet up at our usual bar to watch the game, and I told him I couldn't be around drinking anymore. He laughed at first thinking I was joking, then got quiet when he realized I was serious. He said I'd changed and not in a good way, that I used to be fun, and now I was turning into someone he didn't recognize. We both knew without saying it that this was the end of our friendship, and he hung up without saying goodbye. Every morning I practiced in the mirror saying my son's name out loud without flinching or adding explanation. "This is my son Jameson," I repeated over and over until the words stopped catching in my throat. The next Thursday, My phone alarm didn't go off, or maybe I turned it off in my sleep, because I woke up at 11:30 when my therapy was supposed to start at 11. I grabbed my phone and saw 3 missed calls from Melinda's office, and my stomach dropped, because this was exactly the kind of thing I used to do when I was drinking, just not show up to things. I called back right away, and the receptionist sounded annoyed, but I paid the $50 no-show fee over the phone, and she squeezed me in at 3:30 that afternoon. 2 days later, Elaine sent me a text about a blessing ceremony she was planning for Jameson at her mother's church, just immediate family on Sunday afternoon. I showed up 20 minutes early wearing my only clean dress shirt and sat in the back row letting Elaine run everything while I held Jameson when she needed her hands free for the candle lighting part. Her mother kept giving me these looks like she was waiting for me to mess up somehow, but I just stayed quiet and did whatever Elaine asked. That week, we sat at the kitchen table with our calendars and notebooks spread out, creating this detailed schedule of who had Jameson when. We wrote down everything from pickup times to who bought diapers that week, to which nights were my overnights once those started. Having it all written out meant we didn't have to negotiate every single thing anymore, and I could see exactly when I'd have him, which helped with planning my meetings. The mediation session with Desmond happened in his downtown office with those leather chairs that made noise when you moved. I brought up the idea of adding Hope as a middle name to show we were committed to getting better, and Desmond wrote it down on his yellow pad, while Elaine sat there with her arms crossed, not saying yes, but also not immediately shooting it down like I expected. After I finished talking, she pulled out this typed list of requirements, including random drug tests that I'd pay for, monthly bank statement reviews, and a whole section about what would happen with custody if I relapsed. I signed everything she wanted because, honestly, having it all spelled out made me feel safer too, like there were guardrails now. Desmond said he'd draft a formal agreement about the middle name change being contingent on 6 months of documented sobriety, with me covering all the court fees and paperwork costs. We shook hands at the end, and Elaine said she'd think about it, which was more than I'd gotten in months. 3 days later, Desmond emailed me this 12-page document outlining exactly what would happen if I drank again, including supervised visits only, child support increases, and Elaine getting sole legal custody. I printed it out and signed every page, then scanned it back to him, because seeing those consequences in black and white made everything more real than any AA meeting had. The apartment I found was in this older building 10 minutes from the house with brown carpet and windows that didn't quite close all the way, but it was month to month, and the landlord didn't ask too many questions. I moved my stuff out on a Tuesday, while Elaine took Jameson to a doctor appointment, just taking my clothes and some kitchen basics, and my 1-year chip from AA that I kept on the nightstand. The first overnight visit was that Friday, and I documented everything, taking pictures of the baby-proofed outlets and the receipts from the grocery store showing I'd bought formula and diapers. Jameson slept in the pack-and-play I'd bought secondhand, and I stayed up most of the night checking on him every time he made a noise, but we made it through and I dropped him off Saturday morning exactly at 9 like we'd agreed. Each week I'd email Elaine a list of which meetings I'd attended with the signatures from the meeting secretary, and she'd send back a simple, "received," but I kept doing it anyway because consistency mattered more than getting credit. During our session that week, Melinda had me write down how I saw myself, and I wrote, "alcoholic father who failed," which she crossed out, and had me rewrite as "father in recovery doing the work." And even though it felt like just word games at first, I started saying it to myself in the mirror each morning. The blessing ceremony ended up being on a rainy Sunday, and I stood in the back, holding the umbrella over Elaine's grandmother. While the minister said prayers over Jameson and I didn't try to make any speeches or draw attention to myself, just participated when they needed me to. Felix kept reminding me that this wasn't about winning or losing, but about showing up consistently, and I tried to remember that when Elaine would barely look at me during drop-offs. The custody schedule started working better once we stopped trying to talk about anything except logistics, and I learned to text instead of call with questions about Jameson's feeding schedule or nap times. By the end of the month, I'd made it to 60 days sober, but I only told Felix and Melinda, not posting about it on social media or expecting anyone to throw me a party, because recovery was about doing the work, not performing it for others. The blessing ceremony was the next Sunday, and I showed up early to help set up chairs in the church basement while Elaine's mom arranged the food table. I carried Jameson during the actual blessing part and kept my mouth shut when the minister asked if anyone wanted to say something special, just standing there holding my son while other family members talked about their hopes for him. Elaine noticed the wooden blocks I'd left in the nursery when she picked up extra diapers from the house, and actually thanked me for keeping up with meetings and therapy, though she said it quick and quiet like she didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Her saying thanks meant more than if she'd made some big speech, because I knew how hard it was for her to say anything nice to me at all after everything I'd done. The court date for the middle name addition came 3 weeks later, and the judge approved adding Hope without much discussion since both parents agreed, and the paperwork was in order. We told both families at dinner that night, and everyone seemed glad to have something good to talk about instead of all the bad stuff from before. My mom actually cried when she heard about the middle name and said it was perfect for a baby who'd been through so much already. At Jameson's 3-month checkup, we both went together and took turns asking the doctor questions about his weight gain and development milestones. I wrote down everything in a notebook while Elaine held him for the shots, and we switched when he needed comforting afterward. The nurse commented that we worked well as a team, and neither of us corrected her about the separation, because in that moment, we were just two parents caring for their kid. That weekend, during my overnight visit, I read Jameson a bedtime story and used his whole name for the first time without forcing it or feeling weird about it. I said, "Good night, Jameson Hope," and kissed his forehead, and the name felt like it belonged to him now, instead of being this awful reminder of my drinking. Elaine texted me Monday suggesting we try having dinner together once a week with clear rules about what we could talk about and what was off limits. She said we could discuss Jameson's schedule and needs, but nothing about our relationship or my drinking or anything from the past. I agreed right away because any time with both of them was better than these quick handoffs in the driveway. Our first dinner was awkward with lots of silence, but Jameson smiled at both of us, and that made the quiet parts easier to handle. We ate the pasta I made and talked about his sleeping patterns and whether to start rice cereal soon, and it felt almost normal for about 20 minutes. After dinner, I went back to my apartment and called Felix for our nightly check-in, where I told him about the dinner, and he reminded me that progress isn't always obvious when you're in the middle of it. I put my 60-day coin on the nightstand next to Jameson's hospital bracelet that I'd kept from when he was born. Looking at both of them together reminded me how far I'd come, but also how much work was still ahead. Tomorrow would be day 61, and I'd wake up and do the whole thing again, because that's what recovery meant, showing up every single day no matter what. Felix always said the days add up when you're not counting them, and I was starting to understand what he meant. The coin caught the light from the street lamp outside my window, and I turned it over in my fingers, thinking about all the meetings and therapy sessions and awkward conversations that got me here. I set my alarm for 6, so I could make the early meeting before work, and put the coin back next to the bracelet. My phone buzzed with Elaine's text confirming Wednesday pickup time, and I replied with a thumbs-up emoji, because sometimes that's all the communication we could manage. The apartment was quiet, except for the radiator clanking, and I thought about Jameson sleeping in his crib 10 minutes away. Soon, I'd have him for 2 full days in a row, once the court approved the extended weekend schedule we'd requested. For now, though, I had today's sobriety and tomorrow's meeting, and a son whose middle name meant something better than his first name. That was enough to fall asleep feeling like maybe I wasn't completely ruining everything anymore. That's the end for now. Thanks for spending a few minutes here with me. It really makes sharing these moments special. I hope it added something good to your day. Subscribe if you'd like to keep that going.